Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Cheyenne and I like to talk about media, tech, culture, and society. This is actually the third video in a series of videos that I'm making about every theory in a communications degree. I did my undergrad in communication studies and this video is about communication models. If you haven't watched my videos already on semiotics and representation theory, you're going to want to do that first because this kind of builds off of those previous videos. So the reason I'm making a video about just communication models is because this is where semiotics and representation theory really make that jump to cultural studies. Communication is the transmission of a message from one person to another so that message is common between the two. So that person can be a sender or a receiver, it can be a singer to an audience, it can be a TV show to a culture. It's not always person to person, but there is a sense of one entity creating a message and a second entity receiving that message. So in my previous videos about semiotics and representation theory, we talked about creating codes, we talked about creating meaning, and how having a shared meaning is what creates a culture. So meanings are transmitted through language, yes, but also through actual communication. That's how it leaves your mind and enters another person's mind. So how these theorists have thought about communication over the years has changed. There's actually three major models that are relevant to communication studies, and those are the linear or transmission model, the interactive model, and the transactional model. And what all these three models of communication have in common is that there's a sender, a receiver, and a message. But how they differ is what happens to that message before and after communication and the roles that the sender and receiver plays in the process of communication. The first model of communication that I want to talk about today is the linear model of communication. This is also known as the mathematical or transmission model of communication. This model of communication was created in 1949 by Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver. These two men were engineers for Bell Laboratories, obviously working on the telephone back in the day. So for them, this model of communication helped them understand the telephone from an engineering perspective. So they have a lot of technical characteristics of sending a message and receiving one. So for them in this model, there are three things: the sender, the receiver, and the message. And along the path of the message being sent to the receiver, there is noise. And for them, noise has no cultural context or connotations. It's literally just the static of the sound that might get to the receiver end. So for them, noise is a bad thing. It interferes with the fidelity of the message being transmitted through the system. So although this model of communication was great for engineers and understanding how to build better telephones, it's not really true in the sense of face-to-face communication. It's more of a telegram or a letter type situation where the people are separated. But obviously in face-to-face communication, there's feedback, there's give and take in the process of communication, and that's not represented in this model. This model is really focused on the sender and the message. The receiver doesn't really play a big role in the success of the communication. For Shannon and Weaver, success of the message is in its delivery, but the sender doesn't know if the message has been delivered, and only the receiver knows. And there's no consideration to whether or not the receiver accepts or denies the message. So this message isn't really helpful when we're trying to understand culture and communication within a culture, but it is very similar to the hypodermic needle theory. So this was a theory that was developed in the 1920s/30s, around the time when people were studying political propaganda. So hypodermic needle theory basically says that if you send out a message, the audience is just going to receive it and accept it in the way that you intended. So again, the audience has no agency. In this theory, the sender is successful in sending out their message just because they've sent it out. And this was how people back then understood propaganda. So your speech or your posters are just going to automatically be absorbed by the audience and they're just going to start agreeing with what you're saying. So obviously this sort of fell out of use over time. And so there's still this remnant in our culture today that says if you hear it in the media, people just automatically agree with it and you have to be more conscious of what you're listening to type deal. So the second model of communication is the interactive model of communication. This model of communication considers communication a two-way process. It includes a sender, a receiver, a message, and noise. However, in this model, the sender and receiver can alternate roles. So communication is thought of as interactive, more like face-to-face communication. So you have a sender, it has a message, it sends that message to the receiver, it encounters noise in the environment or the field of experience. It also considers verbal and non-verbal communication as a part of this field of experience. So when the receiver gets the message, they then absorb it and think of their own message and then become the sender in this model. And so now this new sender has a message, it sends it to the receiver who is the old sender of the message. So in this sense, you have a circular idea of the process of communication. So this model of communication does a better job of considering the back and forth nature of communication, what it calls the feedback loop. And it's really this feedback loop that allows for a deeper and more complex understanding of the participant's role in the process of communication. So in this model, the message can be affected by the noise in the environment, but they break down noise in terms of physical and psychological noise. And both types of noise can impede the ability of the message to be successfully delivered and interpreted by the receiver. In the interactive model of communication, the receiver does have agency, but it's not fully realized. The only agency of the receiver is in their ability to create and send their own message, but the act of interpretation isn't really fully thought of. The physical noise that might be encountered in this model of communication could be like the environment, the surrounding environment that this message is sent in. Do they have to whisper? Are they yelling? Is there a lot of noise that they have to speak over? The psychological noise that might happen in this message is the encoding and decoding process that the receiver has to do. So the interactive model of communication does consider communication as something that is constructed, and the message has to be deconstructed by the receiver in order to be interpreted. And that's what the psychological noise is trying to help us understand. So for the interactive model of communication, communication is about creating shared meanings between the sender and receiver as they alternate roles. So this model kind of focuses on the interactions between the people and not necessarily how successfully that message is transmitted from the sender to the receiver. So the third and last model of communication that I want to talk about is the transactional model of communication. This was sort of developed in the early 2000s, and it really came to life when cultural theories was, connecting representation and semiotics with the work of Stuart Hall. So in the transactional model of communication, communication is thought of as a process that constructs realities. And that might sound like very crazy, but I'm gonna explain how that's possible. So in the transactional model of communication, you have a sender, you have a message, you have a receiver, and you also have noise. In the interactive model of communication, the sender and receiver alternate roles. So once the message is delivered to the receiver then becomes the sender and delivers their own message. But in the transactional model of communication, the sender and receiver can be that role simultaneously. And because communication is a process, this is always ongoing, they're communicating constantly, the feedback loop is instantaneous. So this is really the best representation we have of communication because it really allows for that instantaneous feedback and adaptation of messages when we are face-to-face communicating with other people. So in the transactional model of communication, the agency of the receiver is fully realized. The receiver is thought of somebody that participates in the communication, participates in the creation of the message, and alters the message as it's being delivered. So what this model accepts is that communication as a process happens within a discourse. And in a discourse, you have social, relational, and cultural contexts that play a role in how that message is formed and received. So social context is what we talked about in semiotics. You have codes that create social norms that govern how we talk about certain situations. And then relational context speaks to the relationship that the sender has with the receiver. You're not gonna speak to the same way you're gonna speak to your parents as you would to a stranger. It also takes into consideration power dynamics. Are you speaking to somebody that you report to, or are you speaking to someone that reports to you? All of these types of relationships have an effect on the way that the message is formed and communicated. And then you also have the cultural context, right? The identities that people bring to the process of communication has an effect on the message. So when I say cultural context, I mean gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, class, ability. All of these identities play a role in what happens when you're communicating. So for me, as a Black woman, I have to code switch depending on who I'm speaking to. When I speak to my friends from high school that are also Black, I can speak one way, and when I speak to my friends from high school that are not Black, I speak another way. In a professional setting, you're just gonna not speak the same way that you would speak to your friends from high school. So you're code switching based on the situation. And you're also code switching based on my Black coworkers, my older white coworkers, because we don't have the same cultural backgrounds. And so they're not gonna get the same references that I would drop with my Black friends from high school, right? So code switching is a real noise in the message that I'm creating when I'm communicating, based on the person I'm speaking with. The social, relational, and cultural noise that's involved in creating a message really constructs how that message is received by the receiver and what the receiver does with that message. How do they use that information to then build their mental concepts, build their mental maps about how the culture works. So a lot of that deconstruction of the message has to do with encoding and decoding, which I'll talk about in my next video. But it really is the transactional model of communication that connects representation theory and semiotics to cultural studies. So if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Definitely subscribe if you're looking forward to my future videos on communication studies. Leave a comment if you have more theories that you want me to talk about, because I'm always looking for suggestions and I try to respond to all of my comments. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.